All right, in the last video, as my mic is not in front of me. In the last video, we talked about Singer's case of the child in the pond. What we said about that case was that it seemed very obvious, pretty essentially undeniable that you have a moral obligation to save the child in the pond. Then we said it looks like there's no real significant difference between that case and the case of a starving child somewhere in the world that you could help by donating money. It doesn't have to be a starving child. It could be any person that's fixing to die from some ailment or disease or something that you could solve with very little effort and very little money. And we said, well, if there's no real significant difference between the two, then if you ought to save the child in the pond, then you ought to donate money to save the person from starvation or diarrhea or whatever. And that means that you have obligations to save lots of people because there are lots of people starving and dying in the world of various ailments that we could solve with very little effort and very little money. Okay. Then we considered two possible disanalogies, that is, significant differences between the baby in the pond case and the case of someone starving or dying of some ailment somewhere in the world that you could solve easily. And we said neither of those differences really seems like an important one that could really make the difference between whether you ought to help or not. One was the case of physical distance, and we said physical distance doesn't seem to make a big difference when other things are held equal, when it's just as easy to help. The reason physical distance usually makes a difference is because it usually makes a difference to how easy it is to help. But if it's easy to help, even though it's further away, the further away part doesn't seem to matter. And second, we consider the fact that many people are able to help in the case of the starving people, but you're the only person that could help in the case of the child in the pond. And then we said that also doesn't seem to be a really relevant difference, because it looks like you can be virtually certain in either case that someone is going to die without your help. You can be just as certain in the latter case because you know statistically that there aren't going to be enough people helping in the next 5 minutes that no one is dying of hunger anymore. You can probably be more certain of that, actually, than that there's not somebody hiding behind a tree in the case of the baby in the pond case who's planning on getting there before you to save that baby. So the two significant differences between the two cases we looked at seem to fail. And so it looked like we're left with that initial conclusion, which is, wow, I guess we have moral obligations to donate money to save these people in the rest of the world. In fact, you've done something wrong if you don't. Okay, so today, that's all in the way of recap. Today, we are going to dig down into the details of the argument that Singer makes in a little more depth and in a little more detail. Actually, a lot more detail. So stick with me. The foundational idea here is the same, but what we're going to do by going into the details is see what it's required to make the argument. And as usual, this will point out maybe some weak spots in the argument. By getting the premises and the conclusion out, we might be able to see what assumptions or premises that he's relying on that might not be totally clear, and we might be able to see more clearly a difference between the two cases. And finally, what it's ultimately going to do for us too is transition us into our next topic, which is consequentialism, because it turns out that Singer is assuming a big ethical theory called consequentialism that will be the topic of debate later this semester, I believe next week. All right, so let's get down into it. I'll probably break this up into 2 videos. Okay. So here's Singer's argument in a nutshell. Now, again, I said this is going to get his premises out there, and at the same time, all of these premises seem super plausible. So look, here's the first premise. Dying of hunger is really bad. Dying of hunger or lack of medicine or water or whatever, what have you, dying of the lack of a basic resource is very bad. If it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, and we don't thereby have to sacrifice something of comparable moral significance, we ought to prevent it. Now, this is a complicated premise. We'll talk more about what this means in just a second. There are lots of people who will soon die of hunger, and it is in our power to prevent this. We can prevent this person's death without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. So we ought to prevent this person's death. Okay, we're going to go into these premises in more detail and some of the terms that are used here. It is a valid argument, and so the conclusion is we have this moral obligation. This is what we were saying earlier. We have a moral obligation to prevent someone's death who's fixing to die of starvation or hunger or lack of medicine or whatever. The first premise seems indisputable. It is very bad to die of hunger. It is very bad to die for lack of water or lack of medicine. I don't even want to talk about that one because it's just obvious. And if someone tried to dispute that with me, I'd think, you're just kind of being a smart aleck. That's just really bad. Premise 3 also seems undeniable. I mean, we could look this up on the internet, right? You watch any sad commercial. In fact, I'll show you one here in a minute, or I'll show you a parody of one. There are lots of people who will soon die of hunger, and it is in our power to prevent this. Of course, the first part is true, and it is in our power to prevent it because there are tons of charities out there that you can, by the click of a mouse, as long as you have a credit card or a debit card, give money to, and that money will largely, you can actually see how much of your money will go to the cause in question, but at least largely go to saving lives. And more lives will be saved just because of your donation, right? It's not something like your donation is going to go to pay some bureaucrat sitting at a desk entirely. No, like 80 to 90% in many cases will go to saving, to the primary cause of the charity. So 3 seems hard to deny too. Now, what we need to do is talk about what this phrase comparable moral significance means. What does he mean by this? Well, I think the easiest way to put it is, let's talk about moral significance, and then let's talk about comparability or comparing things, okay? Something of moral significance is just something that changes the goodness of your life. Okay, so we've talked now about what the good life is. Hopefully y'all have some idea of what it is. What are things that could change the goodness of your life? I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. What could possibly affect the goodness of your life? Would a new office chair affect the goodness of my life? I'm using this old, you can't see it, this old school sort of dining room chair. Would it make my life better in real, like in the sense that we've been discussing this semester of actually having a more of the good life, whatever that is, if I got a new office chair? Well, as disputable, certainly borderline at best. Maybe if you think it's going to make me happier and happiness is part of the good life, it would maybe slightly increase the goodness of my life. What about making more money, having a higher salary? Yes, we're getting closer there, right? Because with a higher salary, I can maybe security of my family is important for the good life. Maybe being able to pursue leisure activities like taking my kids camping or being able to stay in a hotel when we travel, and thus being able to travel, or affording healthier food, affording to eat out more, something like that. All of those things could feasibly affect the goodness of my life, and not just, affect aspects of my life that are really not good, just kind of things that I want. And let's go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Clear cases of things that would affect the goodness of my life. If I were starving and someone gave me food, if I were thirsty and someone gave me, or if I was, going to die of thirst and someone gave me water, clearly it affects the goodness of my life because surviving is essential to the good life, right? So let's maybe try to think of a case where it's obvious that it doesn't affect the goodness of my life. If I make $3 million a year and you give me an extra $10, you've done something that really does not have moral significance in our sense of the term. It hasn't made my life any better, right? I can't do anything that really contributes to the goodness of my life. And maybe this is actually important to think about as we think about income levels, right? At what income level do you actually not gain any goodness of life anymore? It turns out most people, when they've done this survey, this was several years ago, but it turns out most people, when they've done this survey, they found that most people, their lives would not be really much better after the $70,000 point. And again, that's for a single income. And I don't know what they're doing as far as dependence goes. They're like, obviously depends on how many dependents you have. But past that point, your quality of life, which is different from the goodness of your life, it's sort of like I don't know how you perceive the goodness of your life, doesn't really go up after that $70,000 mark. So that's important, I think. So yeah, so we have certain things that you could sacrifice without sacrificing anything of moral significance. That person who makes $3 million a year, and let's assume they live in a super cheap area, right? Because $3 million in some areas is not as much as in others, who loses $20 on the sidewalk has not lost something of moral significance at all. Okay, so we kind of know what moral significance is now. It's something that can affect, increase or decrease the goodness or the quality of your life. Now, what does it mean for something to be comparable moral significance? Well, when you talk about comparable, you're talking about comparing two things, right? So comparable means in the same general range, right? So if I talk about, well, would I have to sacrifice something of comparable moral significance in order to give you food or water? What I'm asking is the thing that I lose, is the goodness of the amount of goodness in my life that I lose comparable to the amount of goodness in your life that you gain by surviving? We could do this with non-survival scenarios, right? We could compare the amount of goodness that someone gains in their life from moving from $15,000 a year salary to $30,000 a year salary, to the amount of goodness gained in someone's life from moving from $80,000 to $95,000. It's the same absolute amount of increase, right? You've gone up $15,000. Is the amount, is the moral significance of that gain, is it comparable? You'd probably argue no, it's not in the same ballpark. You gain so much more from going from 15 to 30 than from going, what did I say? 85 to 100 or 80 to 95, whatever I said. You certainly gain something of moral significance in the latter case, going from 80 to 95. Like maybe you can go on more vacations now. Maybe you can take more time off, or whatever. Maybe your kids get to participate in some extracurricular activity that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So there's certainly some moral significance there. It makes your life better, but it doesn't make your life nearly as much better, or even close to as much better, as going from $15,000 to $30,000 a year. So that's what we mean by comparable moral significance. The amount of change in the goodness of your life by making this external change is in the same ballpark. And so what Singer is saying, let me reshare here. Let's look at premise 4 first. He's saying, I can prevent someone's death without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. What he means here is the sacrifice I have to make by giving $50, I'm going to sacrifice what? Maybe eating out with my family. I usually eat out with my family maybe like twice a month. Maybe I have to give up both of those. We usually go somewhere super cheap. So even with 4 people eating, we usually don't spend a lot. But yeah, if I gave up both of those per month, I could save $50. And I could use that $50 to, let's say, save someone's life. We're just assuming that we could do it for $50. It seems plausible to me. Now, the question is, what 4 is saying is, I can prevent that person's death without sacrificing something in the same ballpark of moral significance as not dying. And that seems true in this case. The amount of goodness that I would get in my life from eating out twice a month with my family is not even in the same ballpark and not even close to the moral significance, the amount of goodness someone gets in their life from not dying. And we could go on about that. I could sacrifice so much more before I ever even got close to that point. What's the next $50 do for me after I've already stopped eating out? I pay a little bit of money every month to do judo. My wife pays a little bit of money every month to be a member at Planet Fitness. Is that what it is? Yeah, Planet Fitness. And so we could easily give up our workout routines. Is the amount of goodness in our lives lost by giving up workout routines anything close to the quantity of goodness gained by not dying? No, not even close. Not even close. So yeah, 4 would still be true. Again, I could prevent this person's death without sacrificing anything of comparable or even close to comparable moral significance. And 2 just claims, yeah, and if you can prevent something really, really bad from happening without sacrificing of anything that's even in the ballpark in terms of moral significance, then you ought to do that thing. You ought to make that sacrifice because you're giving up something of such inconsequential moral significance. It can do so little good for you and so much good for someone else, then you ought to do that thing. That's what 2 says. So that's the argument. 2 seems true. 4 we just said. Okay, here's the thing. We should back up a little bit. Whether 4 is true is going to depend on your situation. Obviously we all have different situations, but I think we all have money that we use that would produce more good in saving someone's life than it produces when spent on ourselves. It's true of that tuition. What is the amount of moral significance provided in your life by taking this class? Well, okay, I'd like to think it's pretty significant. But as much as I want to flatter myself, oh, they're thinking about the good life and they're thinking about how they ought to live and they're thinking about what they ought to do and what their obligations are to their family and to their friends and what a virtue is and, oh, how can they achieve courage and generosity? That's important, but as much as I flatter myself about how much goodness in your lives that's going to create, I cannot, as much as I delude myself, maintain that the level that amount of importance is even comparable to the goodness provided by preventing someone from dying. And so I'd say, if Singer's right, that money, if you spent money on this course, is something that the goodness is not comparable to the good you could achieve by saving someone's life. And if 2 is true, then you ought to spend it on saving someone's life rather than this course. Sorry. So this is a crazy argument, but it looks like, here's what I love about this argument. The conclusion is crazy. And if you don't realize that the conclusion is crazy, and I say crazy in that like it's really counterintuitive. That doesn't mean it's false. It might be true. But it's also crazy in the sense that it demands so much of us. So much. Because here's the thing, like I was just gesturing at, it doesn't just work once, right? That first $50 that you could spend on eating out, but not on, but you should spend it on saving someone's life instead. There's another $50 behind that, right? Your Planet Fitness, your judo money. There's another $50 behind that. That's, eating, I don't know. You could go on and on and on. And what it eventually gets you down to, if that's right, is if you really should give every dollar to someone else if it could do significantly more good for them than it does for you. Well, the problem is there are tons of people in the world that are on the brink of death. And so it doesn't matter how many dollars you have. Even if you're Bill Gates, your money is not going to be exhausted in saving lives. Or sorry, your money is going to be exhausted in saving lives. You're not going to get to a point where you have $3 million left, even if you're Bill Gates, and you're like, oh, I'm done saving all the lives now, right? So at what point does it stop? Well, the answer is when you get to a point where your next dollar would sacrifice something of comparable moral significance to death, or sacrificing life, that is. So what is comparable to a life being saved? Hard to say. It might be a gray area. Certainly if you died or one of your children died by your next donation, that would be comparable moral significance to death. It's really kind of equal moral significance. But what's comparable in the same ballpark, maybe if your kids had to go hungry for days at a time by your next donation. But here's the crazy thing. I would call that comparable to death. If they had to go hungry on a long-term basis, it's not the same moral significance as death, but it's comparable. It's in the same ballpark, right? Starving but not dying is in the same ballpark as starving to death. But what that means is, if Singer's right, you've got to donate up to that point. You've got to donate right up to the point to where you're going to be, assuming that that's the point at which you've sacrificed something of comparable moral significance, you got to donate right up to the point of your kids starving on a long-term basis, but not dying. So right to the point where they're eating the absolute cheapest bulk pinto beans and rice that you can buy, and maybe they're even only eating 2 meals a day, and no one's working out and no one's going out to eat, and you live in a tent down, or you live in a van down by the river, if anybody gets that reference. If Singer is right, and if all of these premises are true, and this is a valid argument, then that is what you are obligated morally to do. Now, maybe some of y'all are thinking, yeah, okay, I'm just going to go live in a van down by the river. But I say it's a crazy conclusion because it's a really uncomfortable conclusion. And not only that, you might think it's an immoral thing to do. Here's why I say that. Think about, I'm just going to go to my easy low-hanging fruit here. Think about your kids, if you have kids, or imagine having kids if you don't have kids, or imagine your parents acting like this to you when you were a kid. You would probably think that your parents were bad parents for doing that. We have some sort of special obligation to some people. It's not just your kids. You have special obligations to your friends, right? You have special obligations to your parents, to your aunts, to your uncles, to your family in general. You have special obligations to your maybe religious community if you're a member of a religious community. So all of these people paying tithes to churches, I mean, what does that do? It pays a pastor's salary. It maybe pays some missionaries living expenses. Pays to keep the lights on in the church. Is any of that a comparable moral significance to someone dying? No. So Singer's right. You can't do that either. But you might think, no, part of living a good life is fulfilling these sort of special obligations and these special to these people that you're in relationship to, your family, your friends, your community. And those are obligations that we don't have to strangers, right? I don't have an obligation to keep someone else's church's lights on. I have an obligation to keep my church's lights on. I don't have the same obligation to your kids as I have to my kids. I don't need, even if your kids are doing worse than mine, you're not going to call me a bad person for spending money on my kids as opposed to yours, assuming that's not like totally, what's the word? Over the top, right? You know, if I buy my kid a backpack for school, even though they have one that kind of has a hole in it that's been patched, you're not going to call me a bad person because, oh, there's someone over there whose kid doesn't have a backpack at all, or has a backpack that's in worse condition than your kids. In fact, you'd say, well, if you were to do that, it'd be kind of, I mean, something weird, at the very least, morally weird about that, right? You need to take care of your kids, even though there are kids who are worse off than your kids in the world. Okay. So this is a wild argument. What makes it so even wilder, though, is that it's very hard to point out a premise that is false. So let's look at it again. Well, like we said, 1 is undeniable, and 3 is undeniable. And it also seems true that 4 is undeniable. Like for all of us, at least, I think you could sacrifice some amount of money in your life, whatever it takes to save someone's life, let's call it $30, without sacrificing something, without sacrificing an equal or even comparable amount of goodness in your life that's comparable to the amount of goodness you would provide to that person by them not dying. So if there's a problem, it's got to be with 2. And that means that it could be in your power to prevent something really bad from happening, and you don't even have to sacrifice something of comparable moral significance, but you could fail to have an obligation. That's a really awkward way of saying that, but I'm giving you the counterexample form. Maybe sometimes you could prevent something really bad from happening. You don't have to give up very much, but you don't have an obligation to prevent that bad thing from happening. So I think if we're going to deny one of these premises, it's got to be two. I want to show you Singer actually gives two versions of his argument. And I will give you the next version in the next video. So he gives a more moderate version. I think this video has gotten long enough. He thinks this version is true, but he says if you've got a weak stomach, like apparently all of us do, I'll give you a more moderate version that still entails that you ought to be doing a lot more than you're currently doing. Okay, and I'll see y'all in that video.